Welcome back. All right. In this series of videos, I want to first cover what skills are, Claude skills. And then in the next section, we'll look in a bit more detail at a few of them, because this is really how you teach Claude how to help you with your work over and over again without worrying about hallucinations and all of the other negatives that you've heard about AI in general. Skills are a wonderful mix of both. That was interesting. There we go. A wonderful mix of automation and AI, as we'll see. So, quick review before we start, or reminder before we start. Commands, custom slash commands, as they used to be called, have now been retired and are getting merged with skills. So depending on when you watch this video, commands may still be a thing, or they may have disappeared entirely. For now, if you have a command, like I have my /gm command that we've talked about earlier, that can live as either a command or a skill. When you type /review, in this case, that can trigger both of these different things. So in the past, I would have a skill, and rather than say to Claude every time, hey, use the blah, blah, blah skill to do, blah, 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 I would create a command just to kick that skill off. Anthropic, being as smart as they are, they were aware of lots of people doing a similar thing. So they've just got rid of the command, and now when you type that /, you can kick off a skill in exactly the same way. So you just, if your thing is called review, your skill is called review, you start typing /re and it pops up. You can either tab to write something after the /review. That's called an argument. We'll talk about that in a bit. Or you just hit enter and it fires off the skill and you're off and running. The skill structure itself, at its simplest, it is a folder. Now that folder name must be all lowercase and what's called kebab case. So that means you separate the words with hyphens. So you haven't got any capital letters in there. You certainly don't have any spaces in there. It's the geeky codey way of naming things. The most important thing inside that folder is the skill MD file. And that's all in capitals, the word skill in capitals, .md. As we've talked about before, just a markdown file. It's nothing fancy, just a text file with some fancy formatting. But AI just loves to read that format. It understands that format really well. It's just a really nice shorthand way, essentially, of being able to say, hey, this is a really important part. If you're familiar with web design, an H1 tag, a headline versus an H2 tag, a subheadline. Instead, we just have one hashtag next to the headline and then two hashtags next to that subheadline. And you can go 3, 4, 5, 6 hashtags, and that tells the AI, as well as the thing that renders it, that turns it into something visible and readable, it explains to the AI that hierarchy of what's the most important and what is a section head versus something that's less important. It's just a very, very efficient way of doing that, i.e. doesn't use a lot of characters, which when we're dealing with AI and paying by the token, paying by the part of a word, that token efficiency is really, really useful. So at a minimum, it's going to have a skill MD file, but then we can also have some other folders in there. And typically you'll see something like scripts, because maybe we've got some scripts that the AI wrote for itself to use in the future. Or you might have a resources folder, or an examples folder, or a references folder. And that's where just other supporting documentation can go. I'll explain all that as we go here. But the main thing is that you have the skill MD file correctly named, again, all uppercase, in the skill folder. Everything else is optional. And then inside that skill MD folder, the most important thing really is this name and description at the top. So inside this little 3 lines above and here, this is called YAML front matter. YAML is just another computer language. You don't really need to know about it. Let's just call it front matter for now. And then the rest of this document is in Markdown, and that contains the instructions. Now, we've talked about context windows before in earlier videos. And I've said that one of the things that makes so efficient, what makes Claude Code work so well, is this thing called progressive disclosure. So in other words, it only reads documents when it feels it needs to. And we talked about that main Claude MD file getting loaded in at the top of the context window at the start of a new conversation. When it's doing that, it also reads the name and description, not the whole document, but the name and description of all of the skills that you have in your Claude skills folder. So it understands essentially what's in the toolkit. It knows the various skills that it is able to use. It understands what the skill does. And usually, so what all of my descriptions will say, this is what it does, and this is when to use it. That's a really useful way to write skills. But don't worry, you're not actually going to have to write this document, certainly not by hand. You're going to create these by chatting to Claude, as we'll see in a minute. So name and description of every skill gets loaded into the context window at the start. And then when you say something like draft a blog post, Claude says, aha, I know what I need to do here. I've got a skill for that. And then it comes and reads all of this document. This is the progressive disclosure thing that we talked about before. And then inside the description down here, it might say, in this particular use case, you need to do something like this, or Mike wants the output to be in this format. And here's a reference template that you need to follow. And it might then reference other files. Those other files are going to be in the scripts or the examples or the reference folder that's also all contained in that skill folder. So you've got .claude right at the top. Within that, you've got multiple file folders. For now, we're just worrying about skills. So .claude/skills. And then we've got the folder that contains everything required for this particular skill, your skill MD file and these other folders. And this can refer to those other files in the folders that are inside this big skill folder. I said folder a lot there. Hopefully you're still with me. As far as the front matter goes, let's swap sides here. The most important things are obviously name and description. Add that to every single skill. The name is what you're going to see when you type that / and start typing, so /GM or /draft post. That's what you're going to see. That's how you communicate to Claude the skill that you want to run. More on that in the next slide as well. The description is obviously telling Claude then what it is, what it does, and when to use it. And then you've got some additional ones that are fully optional. You definitely don't need to use these on day one, but it is worth knowing about because, again, you just need to know what's possible so that you are able to ask for it. You don't have to know how. You just need to know what the Lego bricks are so that you can ask Claude to go build with those Lego bricks. So one newer option that you have is context. If in this YAML front matter you have context set to fork, then what happens is when you invoke this skill, it will kick off. Let's talk about these two as a pair, actually. Context set to fork and agent with a name next to it. And if you have that set up, if this is set to fork, it basically takes the whole conversation so far and then takes all of that, throws it over to a new context window and goes and grabs the agent that you've told it to use and says, right, you're in charge now. You need to do this thing. Given all of this context, given all of these instructions, we're starting a new context window with a particular agent, which is another file that lives up in your .claude/agents file. And the agent then gets to work, does everything that it's told to do, and then hands back to the original conversation the result of that agent's work. That might be the URL of a new markdown document that it's created, or a summary of some work that it went to go off and do, or an image that it wandered off to create. The benefit of this is rather than kicking off a new agent in a completely new, clean, think of it as like sterile hospital environment with no context, then you have to tell it everything that it needs to do. The benefit of doing it this way is it has that context from the beginning of the conversation. So the back and forth that you've been having, the stuff that you did before you invoked this skill, all of that gets passed across to the subagent. And as we know, they like context. Context is everything. Now, if you really want to get control over who can use the skill and who cannot, there are a couple of commands. I'll just mention this one. Disable model invocation means if that's set to true, the model, the AI Claude code, can't kick off, can't invoke that particular skill. There are times where you might do that, for example, sending an email. And then there's a few others there. You can specify which model the skill is going to use. So if you want to save a bit of money, you can say use the Haiku model instead of the default Opus model. And some other bits and pieces that you really don't need to worry about yet, but just know there are other options. So to invoke a skill, again, as I said, you start typing / and then start typing the name of the skill name. You don't even have to finish the whole thing most of the time. You just hit enter. Sometimes though, Claude will decide that a particular skill is relevant. So you haven't explicitly said, hey, I want to use this skill right now, which you do by typing. It will decide. And part of that could be because you have said through natural language, hey, Claude, use the draft post skill to write a blog post about XYZ. That would be Claude deciding from your input to invoke that skill. But that might also be it's in the middle of doing something else, maybe a different skill entirely, and it has decided, oh, I've got a tool in my toolkit that does that thing that I need. I will go and invoke this other tool so that I can finish the task that I'm currently working on. And if you don't want Claude to be able to do that, again, you say disable the model from being able to kick this thing off. Send example is the example I use. Send email is the example I usually use for that. So next video, we're going to look at some standard skills that come loaded up with Claude Code, and then we'll talk about some other skills that I give you as part of the 80/20 brain. I will see you there. Bye for now.